The rain started fine, almost invisible, and the asphalt reflected the white lights of cars as if the ground held memories of a clearer time. Before we delve into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The man walked slowly, a bag on his back, his jacket soaked, and his eyes fixed on the ground, searching for the metallic gleam of the aluminum cans that fate left in his path. There was an ancient silence about him, the kind of silence that doesn't come from the world, but from within. The silence of someone who learned to exist without being noticed. His steps were slow, measured by the weight of years, accumulating not just in his body, but in his soul. Every movement seemed to have been rehearsed thousands of times until it became instinct. The bag on his back swayed with the rhythm of his walk, and inside, the cans made a soft, metallic sound, almost musical in its constant repetition. It was a sound that was part of the urban landscape, like the noise of cars or the distant whistle of a crossing guard. A sound no one truly heard. Invisible, like the man who produced it. The jacket he wore no longer had a definable color. Perhaps it had once been blue, or black, or gray. Now it was just an undefined shade of accumulated grime, crude patches, and fabric worn by time and constant rain. He was soaked to the bone. Water streamed down his broad but stooped shoulders, ran down the sleeves that had holes at the elbows, and dripped from his rough, calloused fingers as he bent down once again to pick up another crushed can, unceremoniously discarded on the curb. There was no rush in his movements. Each gesture seemed part of a sacred ritual, executed with a reverence that contrasted strangely with the humility of the act. He bent down carefully, as if his body longed for rest, but his will was still strong enough to continue. He picked up the can with both hands, examined it for a brief moment to assess the condition of the aluminum, and then placed it inside the bag. The metal clinked against the dozens of others already there, creating that dull symphony of survival that accompanied him like a constant soundtrack to his days. Sometimes, when a can was particularly dirty or too badly crushed, he cleaned it. He pulled an old, frayed, stained, but still functional handkerchief from his jacket pocket. He ran the cloth over the aluminum surface with circular, almost tender movements, as if polishing something precious. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to anyone rushing past, but it carried the kind of dignity that separates those who merely survive from those who still fight, even without apparent hope, to keep something of themselves intact. The handkerchief had originally been white, or at least it had been at some distant point in the past that he barely remembered now. Now it was grey, stained, but he treated it with care. He folded it precisely before returning it to his pocket, as if that piece of cloth were a treasure. And perhaps it was. Perhaps it was the last connection to a time when having a clean handkerchief in his pocket was normal, expected, common. A time when he had a name people used, a fixed address he could give when asked, people who cared if he came home at night. The rain continued to fall, persistent but without violence. It was the kind of rain that doesn't soak you all at once, but slowly infiltrates, minute after minute, until suddenly you realize you're completely drenched without knowing exactly when it happened. The streets were almost empty at that hour of the morning. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, leaving the city in a grey twilight that seemed to erase the colors of everything. A few hurried people passed, with colorful umbrellas that created points of contrast in the monochromatic morning. They averted their gaze when they saw the man hunched over the trash. It was an automatic, unconscious aversion, practiced so many times that it had become a reflex, like avoiding a puddle, like closing your eyes before sneezing. You just do it, without thinking, without questioning, without truly seeing. On that cold November morning, as the city still awoke amidst collective yawns and distant honks, the man stopped before tall, wrought-iron gates. They were imposing gates, elaborately detailed, speaking of old, well-established money. Each iron bar had been artfully molded, forming designs that imitated leaves and flowers, an attempt to make the metal seem less hostile, less impenetrable. But it didn't work. Those gates weren't just gates, they were statements. Silent but clear warnings that another world began there. A separate world, protected, inaccessible to people like him. The mansion that rose behind those gates seemed to belong to another dimension of reality. It was hard to believe that it and the streets he walked existed in the same city, on the same planet, in the same universe. The difference was so brutal, so absolute, that it seemed like a geographical lie. The house was enormous, 3 stories tall, with classical architecture that exuded tradition and intergenerational stability. The walls were an immaculate white that contrasted violently with the dirty grey of the street. The surrounding garden was perfectly manicured, with trees pruned into geometric shapes that nature alone would never create, a lawn trimmed with millimeter precision, flower beds that must have cost more than he earned in entire months of work. Warm, yellow lights filtered through the wide windows, protected by heavy curtains that never allowed the interior to be fully seen. Even from outside, even separated by yards of distance and layers of glass and fabric, the man could feel the warmth emanating from that place. It wasn't just the physical warmth of fireplaces and heaters, it was the warmth of security, of comfort, of the certainty that there would be food on the table, a warm bed to sleep in, a solid roof over his head when the rain fell. It was the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in so long that he had almost forgotten what it was like. The man knelt there, near the gate, and picked up a crushed can that someone had thrown from the window of a moving car. The can was dirty with soil and trampled by tires, with tread marks imprinted on the dented aluminum. He took his handkerchief from his pocket and began to clean it. He ran the cloth over the surface with circular, almost tender movements, removing the coarse dirt first, then the finer residues, polishing until the metal began to shine, even under the faint light of the cloudy morning. There was concentration on his face as he worked. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened with the effort of discerning details in the dim light. His lips were pressed into a thin line of determination. His hands, though trembling slightly from the bone-chilling cold and the chronic exhaustion that never completely left, performed the work with a precision born of years of practice. It wasn't just mechanical labor. There was care there. There was respect. As if each can deserved to be treated with dignity, even though it was trash to everyone else. The sound of the aluminum being cleaned echoed in the emptiness of the silent street. It was a small sound, insignificant in the grand concert of the city beginning to wake in the distance. But there, in that moment, in that heavy silence of the rainy morning, it seemed to carry its own weight. It seemed to say something without words. It seemed to tell a story of dignity and persistence, of maintaining humanity when the whole world conspires to take it away, of doing the work carefully even when no one is looking, even when it makes no measurable difference, simply because it is the right thing to do, because it is what keeps you human when everything else is trying to turn you into just another disposable object in the urban landscape. He put the handkerchief back in his pocket. He looked at the clean can he held in his hands. He turned it from side to side, examining his work with critical eyes. For a brief moment, something that could be satisfaction passed across his tired face, opening a crack in the harsh lines of constant worry. Then he placed the can inside the bag, and the metal clinked against the dozens of others already there, creating that sound that was the constant soundtrack of his existence. But before moving on, something made him stop. Perhaps it was the grandeur of the mansion. Perhaps it was the brutal contrast between that illuminated world and his world of shadows. Perhaps it was just the accumulated fatigue asking for a moment of pause. He stood there for an instant longer than usual, just looking, just seeing, allowing himself to see without the usual filter of haste and necessity. His eyes scanned the perfectly manicured garden, the trees that seemed to have been placed there by a designer, not by nature. The flowers aligned in geometric beds with coordinated colors, the grass that had probably never known a weed, the fountain in the center spouting clean water in a waste that to him must have seemed obscene, the large windows with their expensive curtains that cost more than he saw in years, the spacious porch with furniture that was possibly more valuable than everything he had ever owned combined. There was something in that gaze too complex to be easily named. It wasn't simple envy, that cheap and corrosive emotion. It wasn't anger, though perhaps he had some right to it. It wasn't a desire to possess, because he was already beyond that. He had already learned that desiring the impossible only amplifies the pain. It was something deeper, more philosophical. It was recognition. It was the kind of feeling that comes when you look at something that could have been your life under other circumstances, with other choices, with another destiny rolled by the dice of chance. It was the acute and painful awareness that a series of small missteps, misfortunes that were not his fault, decisions that seemed right at the time but turned out to be wrong, can lead someone from inside those secure walls to outside them. That the difference between security and the street is smaller and much more fragile than the people inside like to believe. That all of us are always a few personal catastrophes away from becoming invisible, disposable, forgotten. Inside, behind the windows protected by double-paned glass that isolated not only sound but the raw and inconvenient reality of the outside, a woman watched. She stood at the second-floor window, as still as a forgotten statue in a museum no one visited anymore. She held a cup of coffee in her hand, suspended in the air halfway between the table and her lips, forgotten there for so long that the liquid was completely cold, forming a thin film on the surface. Helena was 53, but something about her seemed older. Not her physical appearance. She took good care of herself, used expensive creams imported from Europe, went to the salon every week where competent professionals kept her hair perfectly colored and cut, wore elegant clothes even at home because that's how she had been taught. But there was in her eyes the kind of tiredness that comes not from the body, but from the soul. The tiredness of someone who lives but is not alive, who breathes but doesn't truly feel, who occupies space but does not truly exist in any meaningful sense of the word. From her privileged window, protected by glass and distance, she saw that man bent on the wet sidewalk, concentrating on his task of collecting pieces of what others threw away without a second thought, without considering for even a moment that it could be the difference between eating or starving for someone. She had first noticed him a few weeks ago, just a peripheral blur in her morning vision. But recently, she had begun to truly see him, to pay real attention, to observe not just with her eyes, but with something deeper, more visceral. There was something about him that disturbed her in the most literal sense of the word. He disturbed the smooth, controlled surface of her life like a stone thrown into a still pond, creating ripples that expanded in ever-widening circles, reaching corners she thought were safe from perturbation. She couldn't stop watching him when he appeared. She couldn't help but notice details that before, had she even noticed anything, would have been completely invisible. The reverent care with which he treated each can, the monastic patience with which he cleaned the dirty aluminum, the way his shoulders curved under the weight of the bag, but his movements still maintained a certain grace, a certain essential dignity that could not be taken away even by the most brutal circumstances. There was a presence in him that she no longer saw in the people around her, in the people of her class, her social circle, a raw authenticity, a truth without filters or social varnish, a way of existing that seemed more real, more human, more genuinely alive than everything she knew within her secure walls. Helena's life was comfortable in every way society teaches one to measure comfort. The house was large, spacious, decorated by professionals who charged fortunes to choose curtains and arrange furniture. Her bank account was healthy, fueled by her deceased husband's generous pension and investments that generated enough passive income to live without worries. She had housekeepers who came 3 times a week to clean, a gardener who kept everything impeccably tidy, a personal chauffeur who drove her to the few places she needed or wanted to go, friends who invited her to elaborate luncheons where they talked for hours about absolutely nothing of substance. But there was an emptiness that grew a little more with each passing day, like a hole slowly being dug from within. An emptiness that could not be filled with purchases at expensive stores, or trips to exotic destinations, or dinners at restaurants where the waiters knew her name. An emptiness that screamed silently in the early hours when she awoke in the imported king-size bed, and felt the other side cold and empty for 3 long years. An emptiness that echoed through the corridors of the house too large for one person, amplifying her loneliness in every empty room. It was an emptiness that made her question, in moments of brutal honesty that came in the small hours of the night, if she was truly alive or just waiting, with passive and desperate patience, to finally die and end this charade of existence. Her children rarely called, once a month maybe, if even that. Short, hurried conversations full of well-articulated excuses about important work, impossible traffic, absolutely unavoidable commitments. They promised to visit soon, but soon was an elastic word that always stretched beyond the horizon, never truly arriving. They sent expensive gifts on special occasions, birthdays, Christmas, Mother's Day, as if money spent on objects could replace physical presence, as if things could fill the space left by the absence of real hugs. True conversations, shared moments that meant something beyond a fulfilled family obligation. Her friends were more present, but Helena had begun to realize, with growing and uncomfortable clarity, that most of those friendships were profoundly superficial. They were women who had too much free time and too few real worries, who filled their days with activities that seemed important, but were just elaborate ways to avoid silence, to not have to confront the emptiness of their own lives, who talked a lot, chattered incessantly, but said very little of real substance, who always smiled with practiced and perfect smiles, but were rarely genuinely happy inside beneath the carefully maintained social masks. And then, suddenly, unexpectedly, there was that man, that anonymous stranger who passed her street every morning collecting trash in the persistent rain, who had nothing material, who probably slept in overcrowded shelters or under cold bridges when he couldn't get a spot, who were so far from her social and economic reality that they might as well be different species inhabiting the same planet by coincidence. And yet, inexplicably, when she looked at him through the barrier of glass and distance, she felt something. Something she hadn't felt in a very, very long time, a connection, a genuine curiosity, an interest that went beyond the casual, beyond distant anthropological observation. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story, where he came from, what tortuous paths had led him to that point of collecting trash from sidewalks. She knew nothing beyond what she could see with her own eyes. A man who collected aluminum cans with a care that seemed grotesquely disproportionate to the meager value of those discarded objects. But somehow, mysteriously, that was enough. That was more than she had with most of the people she knew, people she dined and conversed with and exchanged gifts with. Because that observable care, that visible dedication, that silent dignity, said more about who he was than 1,000 polite words exchanged in decorated living rooms would ever say about anyone in her social circle. Helena stood at the window for long minutes after he moved away, slowly disappearing around the bend in the street like a dissolving mirage. The coffee in the cup was completely cold now, useless, but she still held it as if she had forgotten it was in her hand. She went downstairs slowly, still lost in thoughts she couldn't fully organize, which moved in her mind like smoke, taking vague shapes before dispersing again. The house was silent. It always was. Silence was a permanent resident there, more constant than she herself, occupying every room, filling every empty space with its heavy and oppressive presence. It was the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heart beating. The kind of silence that amplifies every small noise, until it seems significant when in fact it is just emptiness. She placed the cup in the sink of the spacious, gleaming modern kitchen with imported marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances that were rarely used because cooking for one person seemed an exercise in futility. She looked out the kitchen window, which faced another angle of the street. He was no longer in sight, only cars passing at their usual speed. Hurried people walking with open umbrellas, protecting themselves from the persistent drizzle. The normal life of the city continuing its indifferent course, unconcerned with small personal dramas happening behind closed windows. But something inside her had changed. A small crack had formed on the smooth, carefully controlled surface of her existence. A small, thin crack, almost imperceptible if you didn't know where to look. But it was there, and Helena knew, with the kind of knowledge that comes not from the brain, but from somewhere deeper and more instinctive, that that crack was not simply going to disappear by being ignored, that it was going to grow, expand, branch out, that through it something new and perhaps frightening could begin to enter, or something old and long forgotten could finally begin to emerge. She spent the rest of that day in a vague but persistent restlessness that she couldn't explain even to herself. She tried to read one of the expensive books that lined the shelves of the library, but the words didn't sink in, didn't make sense. She would sit on the Italian leather sofa with the book open on her lap and realize 10 or 15 minutes later that her eyes had passed over the same lines several times without absorbing absolutely any of the content. She tried to watch television, turning on the enormous set that dominated an entire wall of the living room, but the images seemed meaningless, devoid of any real substance. People too beautiful to be real, talking about problems that weren't really problems, just minor inconveniences disguised as dramas. Expensive commercials trying to sell solutions to needs carefully invented by marketing departments. News programs turning real tragedies into digestible entertainment. Everything seemed fake, empty, of no real importance. She called a friend, more out of habit than a real desire to talk, but hung up in the middle of the conversation with some excuse about a sudden headache. The truth, which she couldn't fully admit even to herself, was that she had nothing to say, and more importantly, she didn't want to listen. She didn't want to participate once again in that elaborate and tiring dance of trivialities that filled time but touched absolutely nothing that truly mattered, that meant anything beyond the superficial. When night fell, bringing a darkness that seemed denser than usual, Helena went up to her bedroom and stood at the same window from which she had observed the man that morning. The street was dark now, illuminated only by streetlights that created yellowish circles on the asphalt, still wet from the day's rain. It was empty of people, silent, patiently waiting for the next day when everything would repeat again in the eternal urban cycle. She stood there for a long time, not really keeping track of time, just looking at the emptiness, thinking without forming complete thoughts, feeling things she couldn't name, for which she had no adequate vocabulary to describe. There was a restlessness within her, a subtle but persistent agitation, as if something long dormant was beginning to awaken, slowly stretching after years of deep sleep. as if questions long buried under layers of routine and passive acceptance were beginning to resurface, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored any longer. She slept poorly that night. She woke up several times, always with the same persistent image in her head, repeating itself like a broken loop. The man bent over the can, cleaning it with that reverent and inexplicable care, as if performing some sacred ritual instead of simply preparing trash for recycling. Why did it affect her so much? Why couldn't she stop thinking about it, reliving that simple moment repeatedly? It made no logical sense. It had no rational explanation. But it was there, insistent, occupying a space in her mind and heart that had once been empty or filled only with trivial worries. The next day, she woke up earlier than usual, awakened not by an alarm, but by some internal clock that had suddenly decided to function again. She didn't even try to go back to sleep. She got up while the world was still dark, showered in the pre-dawn gloom, prepared coffee with hands that trembled slightly from an anticipation she couldn't explain even to herself. She went up to her bedroom and positioned herself at the window, even before the sun began to paint the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Waiting, just waiting, without knowing exactly what for. And he came. Same time as the day before, as if governed by some precise internal clock. Same calm in his movements, same fine rain that seemed never to stop completely at that time of year, as if the city were trapped in some eternal season of melancholic drizzle. Helena felt her heart give a small leap when she saw his silhouette appearing around the corner, emerging from the morning mist like an apparition. A completely irrational leap, disproportionate to the situation, absurd if she stopped to think logically, but real, undeniably real. She observed his every movement with an attention that bordered on the scientific, the precise way he stopped before each object thrown on the ground, how he quickly assessed if it was worth picking up, if it had enough value to justify the space in the bag and the additional weight. How he mentally separated what still had some recoverable value from what was completely destroyed, beyond any redemption. How he placed each approved can into the bag with a smooth, almost gentle, respectful movement. How the bag progressively grew heavier, but he continued, patient, tireless, like Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the mountain every day. There was method in it, there was order born of chaos. There was a kind of practical wisdom developed by necessity and refined by daily repetition over months or years. He knew exactly what to look for, where to look, how to search with maximum efficiency. There was no hesitation wasting precious time. There were no unnecessary movements expending energy that was scarce and valuable. Every gesture was economical, efficient, yet still maintained that inexplicable care that fascinated her more and more. As he collected the cans that morning, methodically working his way along the sidewalk, Helena felt the silence of the house weigh differently. What was once simply an absence of sound now seemed to be the presence of something denser, more oppressive, more significant, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet, but was already casting its anticipated shadow, as if there was tension in the very air, in the very walls, in the very foundations of the building. The distant sound of the cans clinking against each other inside the man's bag became, in some strange and not completely comprehensible way, significant to her. It became an auditory reminder, a sonic contrast between two realities. That man out there, in the rain that soaked him to the bone, working for pennies that barely covered a simple meal, seemed to have more purpose, more reason to exist than she did inside her fortress of comfort and security. He had a clear reason to wake up every day, a task to perform, a goal, even if it was just the basic and primitive goal of surviving another day. It was more than she could honestly say about herself and her empty mornings. The following days brought the same scene repeating like frames of a film stuck on a loop. He came. She watched. They existed in separate and parallel spheres that touched only visually, only through the transparent but absolute barrier of the window glass. But something was growing in that space between them, something subtle but persistent, like a plant slowly sprouting through concrete. A connection that did not depend on words or physical proximity, an understanding that formed in shared silence, in repeated ritual, in the constancy that created familiarity even in the absence of any real contact. Helena began to live for that morning moment. She woke up thinking of him, mentally planning her position at the window. She spent the day in a vague but constant anticipation for the next morning, for the next visual encounter from a distance, and when he finally appeared, punctual as a clock, she felt a strange and inexplicable peace, as if the world, for those brief minutes, made sense in a way it didn't during the rest of the empty and purposeless time, as if there was a hidden order in things, a hidden reason, a meaning buried in simple gestures that most people would never notice. She began to notice increasingly subtle, more intimate details. She realized he wore the same jacket every day. He obviously had no other. That the baseball cap protecting his eyes from the constant rain had a growing hole in the front, slowly unraveling. That his boots, old and worn and patched with duct tape, were still carefully tied every morning before he left. A gesture of dignity maintained against all odds. That even when the rain fell harder, when the drizzle temporarily turned into a downpour, he continued his work, just bending a little more, protecting the bag with his own body, never giving up, never stopping. She also noticed, with growing concern, she didn't know where it came from or why it mattered so much, that he was visibly thinner than the first time she had seen him. His already loose and worn clothes seemed even baggier, hanging on his body like on a hanger. His face, already marked by deep wrinkles sculpted by difficult years, seemed more hollowed, more sunken, his bones appearing more prominently under his skin. His movements, always slow and measured, seemed to require more visible effort with each passing day, as if his body was nearing some invisible but real limit, some breaking point beyond which he could no longer continue. There was in his eyes, on the few occasions when she could see them clearly enough across the distance, an exhaustion that went beyond simple physical fatigue. It was existential, spiritual exhaustion, of someone who carries the immense weight of survival every day, without vacations, without days off, without real rest, without genuine hope that things could improve. It was the deep weariness of someone who knows with absolute certainty that tomorrow will be the same as today, and the day after tomorrow will be the same as tomorrow, in an infinite and identical sequence of days that stretch to some inevitable and probably solitary and forgotten end. And yet, despite everything, he continued. He continued getting up from wherever he slept. He continued going out in the rain that never completely stopped. He continued bending his aching back and picking up cans from the dirty ground. He continued treating each one with that disproportionate and inexplicable care. There was something heroic in it, Helena thought in her moments of greatest clarity. Something profoundly and essentially human and dignified. Something that made everything she knew, all her comfortable and secure life, seem small and insignificant and empty in comparison to that daily persistence. One afternoon, on an unremarkable Thursday that distinguished itself from no other day, something different happened, something small in scale but monumental in significance. The man was collecting cans near the gate, as he always did, following his usual route when he suddenly stopped. He became completely motionless for a moment that stretched, frozen like a statue in the middle of an incomplete gesture, staring fixedly at something Helena couldn't initially identify. Helena, from her elevated position at the second-floor window, tried to see what had so completely captured his attention. She followed his line of sight. Then she realized, with a small start, the gate was ajar. Not completely open, not wide open in an inviting way. Just ajar enough to be noticed by someone paying attention, enough to make a symbolic difference. The gardener had forgotten to close it completely the night before when he left in a hurry, and no one had noticed or cared enough to correct him. The man stood there, absolutely motionless, looking at that opening as if it were a magical door to another universe, another plane of existence. His eyes slowly, almost reverently, scanned what he could see of the garden through that small but significant gap. The perfectly trimmed grass that looked more like a green carpet than real vegetation. The beds of exotic flowers arranged in studied patterns. The fountain in the center continuously spouting clean water in a waste that must have seemed obscene to someone who barely had water to drink. The trees pruned into impossible shapes, and beyond, through the branches, the house, imposing, illuminated even during the day, warm even in the rain, dry even in the storm. There was something in that gaze too complex to be translated into simple words. It wasn't basic, destructive envy. It wasn't covetous desire to possess. It wasn't even superficial curiosity. It was something deeper, more philosophical, more laden with painful awareness. It was recognition of parallel worlds. It was acute awareness of the absurd distance that can exist between two human beings who breathe the same polluted air, walk the same cracked asphalt streets, exist under the same grey sky, but live realities so different, so completely opposite, that they might as well be different species inhabiting separate planets. He took a step forward, small, hesitant, tentative, as if checking if that opening was real or just an illusion, a mirage created by fatigue and hunger. He looked around, carefully checking if anyone was watching, if anyone would appear to expel him, to remind him of his proper place on the other side of the invisible but real line that separates those who have from those who do not. He saw no one in the visible windows. He didn't know that up above, behind the glass that reflected the grey sky, someone was holding her breath while observing his every movement with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. He took another step, slowly, carefully. Now he was exactly at the limit, on the threshold between worlds, one foot still firmly planted on the public sidewalk, safe territory where he had a right to be. The other foot hesitating in the air, almost but not completely crossing the invisible line that separated his world from the world inside those gates. He stayed like that for a long moment that seemed to stretch beyond the normal limits of time, frozen in that intermediary position, neither in nor out, suspended between possibilities, as if something within him fought a silent battle. As if part of him desperately wanted to take another step and enter that impossible garden, and another part knew with absolute certainty that he shouldn't, that it would be transgression, invasion, violation of social rules so fundamental they didn't even need to be written. Finally, after an eternity compressed into seconds, he recoiled. He returned to the safe sidewalk. He placed both feet firmly on the territory that was unequivocally his by right of belonging to that class, that social stratum. But he didn't leave immediately as he always did. He didn't pick up his bag and continue his route. He remained there, standing, just looking through the gates opening at that forbidden and fascinating world. Looking like a child looks at a toy store window, knowing he can see but never touch, never possess, never truly enter. And then he did something Helena didn't expect, something that would change everything in ways neither of them could foresee at that moment. Something small but loaded with such great significance that it seemed disproportionate to the physical act itself. He looked at the cans he had just collected, still holding some in his hand before putting them in the bag. He examined them carefully, turning each one, evaluating with critical eyes. He chose one, the cleanest of all, the least dented, the closest to perfect a discarded and trampled can could be. He took his worn handkerchief from his pocket and began to clean it with even more care than usual, which was already considerable. He ran the cloth over the aluminum surface many times, more times than was strictly necessary for simple cleaning, turning the can from every possible angle, meticulously ensuring that every inch, every millimeter was as humanly clean as possible. When he finished this first cleaning, he took a cleaner part of the handkerchief and wiped it again, polishing now instead of just cleaning, making the metal shine even under the diffused light of the cloudy day. He continued until the can gleamed, until he could see his own distorted reflection on the curved surface of the aluminum. When he finally finished, he held the can for a long moment, just looking at it. There was something contemplative in his posture, something reverent, as if that transformed can, rescued from the trash and elevated through dedicated care, was now something more than just dented aluminum. As if it were a symbol of something greater, something about dignity maintained against all odds, about beauty found in improbable places, about value created through loving attention even when the world says something is worthless and disposable. And then, with a deliberate but infinitely gentle movement, he walked to the ajar gate and carefully placed the can on the low stone wall right next to the iron gates. He didn't toss it casually. He didn't drop it thoughtlessly. He placed it, with both hands, holding it as if it were a fragile and precious object, with a reverence that made it seem like it was a gesture of cosmic importance instead of simply leaving recyclable trash in a convenient place. He stood the can upright, adjusted it, so it was perfectly centered on the flat surface of the wall's top. He took a step back to check the positioning, like an artist checking if a sculpture is at the correct angle. He adjusted it slightly again. And then, apparently satisfied, he took a few more steps back, looking one last time at his silent offering. Then he adjusted the bag on his back, redistributing the weight that seemed to be becoming unbearable, and walked away. Without looking back, without additional hesitation, without knowing that that small, deliberate gesture had just broken some invisible but very real barrier. Without knowing that someone had witnessed everything with inexplicable tears in her eyes. Helena stood at the window, completely motionless, for an indeterminate time after he disappeared around the corner. She couldn't move. She couldn't fully process what she had just seen. She just looked at that shining can on the grey wall, small, incongruent, impossible to ignore. The can gleamed even under the cloudy sky, capturing and reflecting the diffused light in a way that seemed almost to glow with its own light. It was completely out of place in that setting of stone and iron and carefully pruned plants, like an alien object that had fallen from another world and landed there by cosmic accident. And yet, or perhaps precisely because of it, it was impossible not to see it. It was impossible not to be drawn to it. It was impossible not to immediately recognize that it meant something, that it was a message, communication, a gesture loaded with intention, even if the exact intention was difficult to articulate in words. Helena knew, without needing external explanation, without needing someone to decode it for her, what it meant. That was a deliberate gesture. It was a gift given with what he had, which was almost nothing in material terms, but everything in terms of meaning. It was a way of saying something without words, something that perhaps couldn't be said with words because it transcended common language. He was reciprocating, in the only way he could, with what he possessed, with his work, his care, his time, his dedicated attention. With that can which to anyone else in the entire world, to any of the billions of inhabitants of the planet, would be just worthless trash awaiting recycling, but which to him had been worthy of being cleaned until it shone, worthy of being treated as if it were precious, worthy of being offered. Helena felt something stir within her, something large and powerful and frightening. She felt her eyes fill with tears she couldn't completely explain, that came from somewhere too deep to be easily accessed by normal consciousness. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, though there was sadness there. They weren't tears of simple joy, though there was something joyful too. They were tears of recognition, of connection, of something fundamental and essentially human being touched in a way it hadn't been touched in a very, very long time. She went downstairs, not calmly, not with the usual composure she always maintained. She went down quickly, faster than she had in years, almost running, with something urgent propelling her forward. She crossed the hall with hurried steps that echoed in the empty house. She went out the side door that led directly to the garden, not even caring that she was only wearing light slippers and that the garden ground was wet from the constant rain. She walked to the gate with her heart beating at a fast and irregular rhythm that made her hands tremble. She looked around instinctively, as if fearing being seen by neighbors or passers-by, though she didn't know exactly why. She wasn't doing anything wrong after all. She was just in her own garden, checking her own gate. And yet she felt as if she was doing something transgressive, something that violated unwritten but deeply internalized rules. The can was exactly where he had left it, small, simple, impossible to ignore. Helena picked it up with both hands, replicating, without consciously being aware of it, the same reverent gesture he had made when placing it there. She felt the cold metal against her palms. She felt the insignificant weight that was not measurable physical weight, but immense symbolic weight. She felt the smooth surface that had been carefully cleaned and polished, and she felt something else. Something that wasn't physical, wasn't tactile, but was more real than any purely bodily sensation. She felt humanity contained in that banal object. She felt dignity embodied. She felt connection materialized in recyclable aluminum. There was more truth, more authenticity, more genuine value in that discarded and rescued piece of metal than in all the expensive jewels she kept in velvet boxes in her bedroom. More than in all the expensive but empty gifts her children sent. More than in all the objects that filled her large house but touched absolutely nothing in her atrophied heart. She took the can inside with the same care she would if she were carrying something infinitely fragile and precious. She slowly went up to the living room, taking her time on each step as if performing a solemn ceremony. She placed the can on the imported glass coffee table in a space between expensive books and decorative objects that cost fortunes. There, among all those things deliberately chosen by paid designers to create an environment of good taste and discreet wealth, the can seemed completely out of place. And yet, paradoxically, it seemed to be the only genuine thing there, the only thing that truly meant something. The only thing that told a real story about human connection instead of just demonstrating purchasing power. She sat on the elegant and expensive sofa and simply looked at the can for an indeterminate time. Just looking, thinking, feeling, trying to understand, trying to process what exactly was happening to her. Why did it matter so much? Why was that can, that anonymous man, those silent gestures occupying so much space in her mind and heart? Why couldn't she simply ignore it, forget it, go back to her normal life of inert comfort? She had no complete answers. She had no explanations that completely satisfied logic, but she had fragments of understanding. She had the intuitive feeling that something important was happening, that some fundamental change was underway, that crack that had formed days ago on the surface of her life was now rapidly expanding, and through it, something was entering that she didn't know she needed, but that she apparently needed desperately, urgently, like a person lost in the desert needs water. That night, before going to bed, she returned to the living room and picked up the can again. She held it in her hands, feeling the metal that had already absorbed the room's temperature. She took it to her bedroom. She placed it on her nightstand, next to the old photograph of her deceased husband. That photo that had been there for 3 years, as a relic of a life that seemed to have happened in another temporal dimension. The can lay there, small and shiny, close but separate from the expensive silver-framed photograph. It was the last thing Helena saw before turning off the light, letting the room plunge into darkness. And it was the first thing her eyes automatically sought when she awoke the next morning, checking if it was still there or if it had been just a strange dream born of prolonged loneliness. The following days brought a routine that seemed the same on the surface, but was fundamentally different in its depths. He continued to come every morning with the regularity of a tide following the moon. He continued to collect his cans with the same meticulous care. But now, whenever he passed near the gate, his eyes inevitably moved to the wall, checking, searching, waiting for something he himself probably couldn't define. As if that gesture he had made, leaving the polished can, had created an expectation, opening up a possibility of communication that hadn't existed before. Helena continued to observe from the window with her morning vigil that had become as sacred a ritual as any religious practice. But now there was something different in her gaze, in her posture, even in her breathing. It was no longer just passive and distant observation. It was active and engaged attention. It was a wait charged with anticipation. It was a search for something that had no name or definite form yet. A week passed with this new, silent dynamic. Then 2. The can remained in Helena's bedroom, on the nightstand, like a sacred relic or a protective talisman. She would pick it up sometimes, several times a day, when passing through the room, holding it in her hands for no functional reason, running her fingers over its smooth surface, and whenever she did, she thought of him, of the meticulous care with which he had cleaned it, of the deliberate gesture of placing it on the wall, of what that meant about dignity maintained in impossible circumstances, of what that said about him as a person. And then, without warning, without preparation, he stopped coming. One day passed without him appearing at his usual time. The street remained empty during the time he would normally be there, working in the persistent drizzle. Helena waited at the window long past the usual time, continuing her vigil even when it became obvious he wouldn't come. She waited with growing anxiety, with a concern that intensified with each passing minute without his appearance. On the second day, the anxiety had turned into something deeper and more frightening. Helena woke up even earlier, positioning herself at the window before there was even enough light to see clearly. She waited with an almost painful intensity. But he didn't come. The street remained empty of him all morning. 3rd day, 4th, 5th. His absence created a void in Helena's routine that was disproportionate but undeniable. Mornings lost their anchoring point. The coffee she religiously prepared every morning lost its taste, becoming just bitter liquid without purpose. The house, already too large and silent, seemed to have grown even larger, becoming cavernous, echoing, suffocating in its empty expanse. Helena began to go out earlier in the morning, into the garden, with weak excuses even to herself about needing to check the plants, evaluate the gardener's work, breathe fresh air. But in truth, she was there to get a better view of the street, to be able to see if he appeared from a different direction, from an unexpected angle, to be able to notice immediately, the second it happened, if he returned. She asked the doorman of the adjacent building, a middle-aged man who had worked there for 2 decades and knew the street better than anyone. "Have you seen that man who collects cans? The one who wears a blue baseball cap and a dark jacket?" The doorman looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise at the question and something that could be compassion or disguised judgment. "The can collector. No, I haven't seen him in a while, Miss Helena. Folks like that come and go, you know how it is. The street is like that, you never know. He might have gone to another area where there's more trash. He might have found something better. I don't know. Or he might have." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't complete the obvious thought. He didn't need to. Helena perfectly understood what was implied in the heavy silence. The street was dangerous, especially for the invisible, the vulnerable, those who had no one to ask about them if they disappeared. Accidents happened. Violence happened. Illnesses happened without access to adequate treatment. People disappeared and simply ceased to exist, and no one knew because no one was paying enough attention to notice their absence. Helena went back inside with a heart heavy with something that was fear mixed with helplessness. She went up to her bedroom and stood at the window, in the same position she had occupied so many mornings. But now, she wasn't waiting to see him appear with real hope. She was trying to accept, forcing herself to accept, that maybe he would never appear again. That it had been just a brief, fleeting moment, an ephemeral encounter. A temporary connection that had already ended before it truly began. 1 week turned into 2. 2 turned into 3 long weeks of absence. Helena tried to return to her previous routine, to the life she had before he appeared, and disturbed the smooth surface of her existence. She tried not to wake up so early, but her body refused to obey, waking automatically at the accustomed time. She tried not to go to the window, but her feet carried her there without consulting her conscious will. She tried not to think of him, but he occupied a constant space in her thoughts. Even when she tried to focus on other things, the can remained on her nightstand. Helena looked at it every night before sleeping, every morning upon waking. She thought, where is he? Is he okay? Is he alive? Is he sick? Is he hurt? Is he simply in another part of the city, or is he somewhere much worse? She thought about how it was possible, how it made any sense, to care so much about someone she had never truly known, with whom she had never exchanged a word, whose personal history was completely unknown to her. And then, on a grey December morning, when the sun struggled to penetrate the dense clouds, 3 weeks and 4 days after she last saw him, Helena awoke to a sound, a distant but unmistakable sound to her ears, which had learned to recognize it among all the other sounds of the city, the metallic sound of cans clinking against each other, the sound she had learned to identify instantly, that awakened her even from the deepest sleep. She sprang up. She didn't even think about putting on a robe or combing her hair or any of the usual small morning vanities. She ran to the window still in her nightgown, barefoot, her heart pounding so hard she could hear the blood pulsing in her ears. And there he was, walking slowly down the street, slower than before, much slower, so slowly that each step seemed to cost visible and immense effort. Helena's heart pounded even harder, now not just with relief, but with acute and urgent concern. He was different, visibly, dramatically different, thinner than he already was, dangerously, unsustainably thin, the bones of his face prominent under skin that seemed too stretched, his body even more stooped, as if every additional ounce of weight was unbearable. His slow movements, not with the usual calm, but with the slowness of someone at the absolute limit of their strength. She watched as he approached her gate, following the habitual route that seemed etched into his muscle memory. Each step seemed a small victory against gravity and exhaustion. He stopped more frequently than before, leaning on walls and posts, needing rest even in the simple task of walking. When he finally reached the gate, he bent down to pick up a can that was lying there. And that's when it happened. His legs gave out. Not completely. He didn't fall entirely to the ground, but he had to hold onto the wall with both hands, staying there, bent, supported, breathing heavily. Even from a distance through the glass, Helena could see that something was profoundly wrong, that he was at his absolute limit, that his body was giving way under the weight of weeks of illness and deprivation. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply reacted, pure instinct overriding all social filters, all considerations of what was appropriate or expected. She threw a robe over her nightgown without caring that it was askew. She slipped her feet into her slippers. She ran downstairs faster than she had run in her entire life. She crossed the hall in a rush that made the pictures on the walls tremble. She unlocked the front door with hands that trembled so much she almost dropped the keys. She ran out into the garden. The morning dew soaked her feet through her thin slippers. Loose stones hurt her soles, unaccustomed to that kind of unprotected ground. But she didn't care. She didn't feel it. She was focused only on reaching him, on checking if he was okay, on doing something, anything. When she reached the gate, he had managed to partially compose himself. He was standing again, trying to regain some dignity, trying to appear less vulnerable than he obviously was. He had managed to pick up the can and was trying to put it in the bag with hands that trembled visibly and uncontrollably. When he heard the creak of the gate opening, he turned. His eyes widened in surprise. Or perhaps fear, or perhaps both mixed with other emotions too complex to disentangle. They stood still, one on each side of the now wide open gate. The physical distance between them wasn't great, just a few feet, but the symbolic distance, the social and economic and class distance, seemed immense, insurmountable. It was the distance between worlds, between realities, between ways of existing so different that they shouldn't even touch, according to all the unwritten but deeply internalized rules of society. Helena saw details she couldn't see from the window, details that broke her heart. The rough, cracked skin of his face, marked by constant exposure to the elements. The deep wrinkles around his eyes, each seeming to tell a story of hardship and persistence. His dry, cracked lips, the ingrained dirt under his broken fingernails. The smell, not very strong because the constant rain helped, but noticeable, of someone who had long not had regular access to a bath and clean clothes. But she also saw his eyes. Eyes that were surprisingly expressive, intelligent, alive despite everything. Eyes that carried stories she would never know but could intuit, were stories of loss, survival, dignity maintained against all odds. He also saw her for the first time up close, no longer just across distances and barriers. He saw the woman he had observed so many times from afar, always through windows and gates and yards of protective space, always unattainable like a star in the sky. He saw that she was older than she appeared from afar, with lines of expression around her mouth and eyes that spoke of years lived. But he also saw, and this was more important than any physical detail, the genuine and unfeigned concern on her face. He saw that she was there, out of her house, in her nightgown and robe and slippers, her hair still disheveled from sleep. He saw that she cared, really cared, and that, more than anything, left him completely unable to speak or move. The silence between them stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, charged with everything that could not be said, but that both felt pulsating in the air between them. Helena opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come immediately. She was breathless from running, yes, but it was more than that. It was the intensity of the moment, the emotional magnitude of what was happening, that stole her ability to form coherent words. Finally, when she found her voice, it came out more choked and trembling than she intended. "You came back." A pause to breathe, to try to control the emotion that threatened to overflow. "I was worried." He lowered his gaze immediately, automatically, like a conditioned reflex of someone who had spent too long being invisible, being ignored, being treated as if he didn't deserve direct eye contact, ashamed to be truly seen, ashamed of the condition he was in, ashamed to be a cause for concern when he thought no one would notice or care about his absence. "Sorry." His voice hoarse, rough from disuse and recent illness, barely audible. "I got sick, couldn't come out, sorry for worrying you." The words were simple but carried immense weight. There was an untold story there, weeks of illness faced alone, weeks sleeping who knows where, without adequate medical care, without medicine, without the basic comfort that makes illness bearable. Weeks in which he could easily have died, and no one would have known. No one would have cared. No one would have noticed his absence in the great indifferent flow of the city. Helena felt the words like a physical blow. She thought of him sick and alone, somewhere she couldn't even fully imagine. She thought of everything she had, the large and comfortable house, the soft bed, the heating, the full refrigerator, the phone to call a doctor if needed, and how none of that had served to help him when he needed it most. She took a step forward, completely out of the gate now, entering his space, the territory of the public sidewalk. He instinctively took a step back, maintaining a safe distance, respecting the invisible barriers, even when the physical barriers had been removed. "How are you now?" Her voice more controlled, firmer, taking on a tone of practical concern. "Do you need anything? Have you eaten? When was the last time you—" She stopped, realizing she was asking too many questions, questions he might not want or be able to answer. That she might be crossing lines she shouldn't, invading privacy that even he, with so little, had a right to maintain. He didn't answer immediately. He stood there, looking at the wet ground, at his own worn boots, anywhere but at her. His shoulders curved not only by the weight of the bag, but by the weight of shame, of social position, of the acute awareness of how much he didn't have compared to how much she obviously had. "I'm fine now." An obvious lie, but spoken with dignity, with an attempt to maintain some pride. Just came to collect the cans. I'll be going now. Sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Helena said quickly, urgently, wanting to make that absolutely clear. "You never bothered me. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I got worried when you stopped coming." He finally looked up. He looked directly into her eyes for the first time since the gate had opened. And in that look there was disbelief mixed with something that could be hope so fragile that it barely dared to exist. As if he couldn't truly believe that someone, especially someone like her, from a completely different world, had noticed his absence, had worried, had missed him. You noticed." His voice still low, but with a note of genuine admiration, of astonishment. "I noticed," Helena confirmed, and there was so much weight in that simple word, so much meaning in 2 syllables. "Yes, I noticed." They stood there just looking at each other, and there was more communication in that silence than in 1,000 polite words exchanged in appropriate social contexts. It was mutual recognition. It was seeing and being seen. It was the fundamental breaking of invisibility that defines the experience of those living on the streets. For him, it was confirmation that he still existed as a person, that he still mattered to someone, that he was still visible in some fundamental sense. For her, it was. It was something she was still trying to fully understand, but that she knew was important, was transformative, was the kind of thing that fundamentally changes a person. He looked away first, unable to sustain that intensity. He adjusted the bag on his back, preparing to leave because he didn't know what else to do, how to respond to this unprecedented situation. "I have to go," he said, taking half a step back. "Thank you for caring. No one. It's been a long time since anyone—" He didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't. The emotion was too close to the surface, threatening to overflow, and he couldn't allow that. Not here, not now, not in front of her. Helena stood still, watching as he slowly turned, as his hesitant steps took him away. She felt an urge to call him back, to offer something more concrete, more substantial help, but she realized, with a wisdom that came from somewhere deep and instinctive, that it would be too much now, that some walls need to be torn down brick by brick, not all at once, that his dignity required it to be gradual, respectful, allowing him to maintain some agency, some control. She stayed there at the gate for a long time after he disappeared around the bend in the street, just standing, feeling the fine drizzle wet her robe and hair, feeling her heart still pounding, feeling that something fundamental had changed, had moved, had been altered in a way that there was no going back. When she finally went back inside, the house seemed different in some subtle but perceptible way. It was still large, it was still silent, but it no longer seemed so empty. There was something new in the air, something she couldn't name but could feel as clearly as she felt the temperature or the humidity. She went up to her bedroom and stood looking out the window for a long time, even knowing he wouldn't return today, that he had already made his rounds. She looked at the can on her nightstand, and she knew what she needed to do, what she wanted to do, what she felt she ought to do. The next morning, she woke up even earlier than usual. She went down to the kitchen while it was still dark outside. She prepared coffee, not just a cup for herself, but an entire pot. Strong, fragrant, hot coffee. She took a large mug, not a delicate porcelain cup, but a real mug that could hold a decent amount and retain heat longer. She filled it to the brim. She also wrapped some fresh bread she had in the pantry. And a banana. Small gestures, modest offerings, but made with care, with intention, with a genuine desire to help, even knowing it was small help compared to the size of the problem. Before the sun fully rose, before any neighbor could be awake to see and judge, she went out and carefully placed everything on the wall, in the same spot where he had left the polished can weeks ago, as a response, as reciprocity, as a way of saying without words, "I saw your gesture and I am returning it." She went back inside and up to the window. She waited. And when he appeared, punctual as ever, she saw the way he stopped when he saw what was waiting on the wall. She saw how he looked around, confused, as if he couldn't believe it was for him. She saw how he approached slowly, hesitantly. She saw how he picked up the mug with both hands, feeling the warmth through the ceramic. She saw how he smelled the coffee before drinking, closing his eyes as if memorizing that moment. She saw how he drank slowly, savoring each sip. She saw how he ate the bread and the fruit carefully, chewing slowly. And she saw how, before leaving, he left something back. A stone, small, smooth, beautiful in some simple way, found who knows where during his walks, carefully placed in the same spot as a trade, as maintenance of balance, as a way of saying, "I receive, but I also give. I am not just a recipient of charity. I have something to offer too, even if it's just a beautiful stone." Helena went down and picked up the stone. She held it in the palm of her hand. Smooth from water and time's wear, small enough to be easily carried in a pocket for days or weeks until finding appropriate use. And she realized that this simple exchange of coffee and bread for stones and polished cans was more significant, more real, more valuable than any transaction she had made in her entire life, of shopping at expensive stores and exchanging expensive gifts with people who could afford anything. The following days established a ritual, an unplanned, undiscussed ritual, but perfectly understood by both through silent gestures that spoke louder than 1,000 words. He came every morning. She left something on the wall, coffee always, and beyond that it varied. Bread, fruit, sometimes cookies, once a piece of cake that was left over from some social occasion she no longer even remembered. He always left something back. He never came empty-handed in reciprocity. Sometimes they were especially well-cleaned cans, polished until they shone. Sometimes they were interesting stones found on his wanderings. Once it was a surprisingly beautiful yellow wildflower that had grown wild between the cracks in the asphalt, surviving despite everything, just like him. They never spoke. After that first encounter at the gate, they never exchanged words again. But they didn't need to. The gestures said everything. The coffee said, "I see you, I care, you matter." The stones and flowers said, "I receive with gratitude, but I also give what I can. I maintain my dignity even when receiving help." We are both human even in such different circumstances. Helena kept everything he left. The cans went to a shelf in the kitchen, aligned like trophies or works of art in a gallery. The stones to a beautiful bowl in the living room, where expensive but historyless or meaningless decorative objects once sat. The flower she carefully pressed between the pages of a thick book, preserving it as if it were a precious relic. Each object was a treasure not for its material value, which was zero or close to zero, but for what it represented. It represented connection. It represented seeing and being seen. It represented dignity maintained. It represented humanity recognized. It represented everything that truly matters, but that Helena had forgotten mattered. Lost in her life of material abundance, but emotional poverty. Weeks passed. Summer gradually gave way to autumn. The trees in the garden began to change color, green leaves turning golden and red. And through all the changes of season and temperature, the ritual continued, unwavering, constant, real in a way that little else in Helena's life was truly real. She found that she now woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, perhaps decades. She had something to do that mattered. Someone who depended on her, even if in a small and limited way. Someone whose life she touched positively. And she discovered that this simple act of making a small but real difference in another person's life, filled a void within her that she hadn't known existed. The gate remained always ajar after that day. Not completely wide open, not in a way that might seem careless or an indiscriminate invitation, but ajar, enough to be noticed, enough to be symbolic, an opening that said, "There is possibility here, there is connection here, there is humanity recognized here." Neighbors commented, of course. Helena saw the curtains move when she went out to leave coffee on the wall early in the morning. She heard the whispers on the few social occasions she still frequented. "Did you hear about Helena? They say she's feeding that homeless man." How absurd! Do you think she's all right in the head? But Helena discovered something surprising. She didn't care. Or rather, she cared much less than she would have imagined. The opinion of those women, which once seemed so important, now revealed itself for what it always was. Empty, superficial, born of fear and judgment, instead of understanding or compassion. A more daring neighbor confronted her directly one afternoon. "Helena, dear, we're all concerned. That man, it's dangerous to let him get so close. People like that can, well, you know." Helena looked at her for a long moment before answering. When she spoke, her voice was calm but had an underlying steel. "People like that? You mean poor people? People in difficult situations? People society has made invisible? That man has more dignity in his little finger than many people I know with fat bank accounts. So thank you for your concern, but I'm fine." The neighbor was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Helena walked away without waiting for a reply, feeling something like satisfaction mixed with liberation. She had spent so long living according to others' expectations, so long worried about what they would say, so long trapped in a cage of social conventions. And now, finally, she was doing something by her own choice, by her own will, because she felt it was right and not because someone approved. Her children eventually found out. One of the neighbors called them, saying they were worried about their mother, that she was acting strange. The children called, with that annoyed haste of people too busy for additional problems. "Mom, what's this about you feeding a homeless man?" Helena took a deep breath before answering. "He has a name. I don't know what it is, but he has one, and I'm not feeding him, a word you use for animals. I'm leaving coffee and bread on the wall. He collects cans on our street every day. It's a small gesture of basic humanity." "But Mom, it's dangerous. Those people can—" "Can what?" Helena interrupted, with a firmness that surprised even herself. "Can they be humans worthy of basic consideration? Yes, they can, and they are. That man has had more presence in my life these past few months than you two have had in the last 3 years. So don't you dare tell me what I can or cannot do in my own home." There was a shocked silence on the other end of the line. Eventually, weak apologies and vague promises to visit soon, promises Helena knew wouldn't be kept and realized she didn't care as much as she used to. After hanging up, she sat in the living room, looking at the bowl with the stones he had left, and she realized she was smiling, truly smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in a long time, because she had just defended something, someone. She had taken a stand. She had spoken a hard but necessary truth, and she felt more alive than she had felt in years. One morning, weeks after the ritual had firmly established itself, Helena awoke with an idea. She sat at the antique desk in her study and took out some fine stationery, that expensive paper she had bought years ago for correspondence she never sent because no one writes letters anymore. She stood still for a long time, pen hovering over the paper, thinking about how to express something that transcended common language. Finally she wrote, just one sentence, simple but carrying everything she had learned, everything that the whole experience had taught her about value and dignity and humanity. There are riches we only understand when we lose the fear of truly seeing another. She read and reread it several times, changed a word, then changed it back. Finally satisfied, she folded the paper carefully, placed it inside a simple envelope. And the next morning, before the sun rose, she placed the envelope on the wall, along with the usual coffee and bread. She watched from the window when he arrived. She saw when he noticed the envelope. She saw his hesitation as he looked at that unexpected object. She saw when he finally picked it up carefully, as if it might break. She saw when he opened it and read. She couldn't see his expression clearly enough through the distance and the glass, but she saw how he stood still for a long time after reading. She saw how he folded the paper with reverent care. She saw how he put it in the pocket closest to his heart. She saw when he looked up, at the house, at the window where she was. She couldn't know if he truly saw her through the reflection of the glass, but he raised his hand in a gesture that was half wave, half salute, half thank you for everything. And Helena raised hers in response. 2 hands raised across the space, 2 human beings separated by yards of distance and worlds of difference, but connected by something that was both simpler and more complex than either of them could fully explain. He left after that, continuing his route, collecting his cans. But Helena noticed something different in his step. It was no longer so heavy. It was no longer so stooped, as if some invisible weight he carried had been relieved, even if only a little. In the days and weeks that followed, the ritual continued, but with a different quality now. Something had been said that needed to be said. Something had been recognized that needed to be recognized. The distance between them still existed. It always would, because they were made of very different realities. But that distance was no longer an impenetrable barrier. It was just space, space that could be crossed by gestures, by care, by that silent way of saying, I see you, in a world where most people had become invisible. Helena's garden began to flourish in a way it hadn't before, not just because the gardener did his job, he always did, but because she was paying attention now. She was truly seeing. She was actively caring instead of just letting others care. She discovered unexpected pleasure in getting her hands dirty in the soil, in planting things and watching them grow. And the gate, always ajar, became a recognized symbol on the street. Some people judged, others secretly admired, and some, not many, but some, began to leave things on their own gates too. Water, food, small gestures of humanity that slowly spread like ripples. But even without knowing the greater impact it was having, Helena and the man whose name she never knew continued their personal ritual, day after day, week after week, an act of consistent care that was perhaps the most revolutionary thing either of them had ever done, even without ever using that word or thinking in those terms, because in the end, it was exactly about that. Not about solving big systemic problems, not about changing the entire world, but about seeing, about recognizing humanity where others saw only category or statistic, about allowing connection where society demanded distance, about having the courage to leave the gate open when it would have been easier, safer, more socially acceptable to keep it closed. And while the world outside continued its crazy, indifferent rush, with its cruel divisions and its rules about who should relate to whom and on what terms, within that small stretch of street something different was happening. Something that should be normal but was extraordinary. Something that should be common but was rare. Something that should be expected but was revolutionary. Two worlds that should not touch were touching through silent gestures. Two people who should not care about each other were caring through modest offerings. Two lives that should remain parallel and separate were intertwining through a daily ritual of coffee on the wall and exchanged stones. And in that improbable intertwining, both were finding something they had lost and didn't even know was possible to recover. He was finding dignity and visibility in a world that had made him invisible. She was finding purpose and connection in a life that had everything except what truly mattered. The man continued collecting his cans, following his daily route with the same meticulous care as always. But now his steps were lighter, the weight less oppressive, his shoulders less stooped, as if the simple act of being seen, of mattering to someone, made a measurable physical difference. And Helena continued observing from the window, maintaining her morning vigil that had become as essential as breathing. But she no longer observed with the distance of someone who merely sees without getting involved. She observed with the tenderness of someone who feels, who cares, who has learned that true wealth does not reside in large houses or fat bank accounts, but in the human connections we build, in the bridges we dare to cross, in the walls we have the courage to tear down brick by brick. The sun continued to rise every morning, indifferent to the small but significant human dramas unfolding beneath its rays. The rain continued to fall, persistent and cold. The city continued its impersonal and hurried routine. And through all this, two unlikely human beings continued their silent ritual of mutual recognition, proving that even in the harshness of concrete and urban indifference, humanity can flourish if we give it space, if we leave the gate ajar, if we have the courage to truly see who is on the other side. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.